Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. And we are in Lycurgus, and I'll probably answer a couple other pronunciations, Lycurgus and Lycurgus, And as for things of lesser importance, as pecuniary contracts and such like, the forms of which have to be changed as occasion requires, he thought it best to prescribe no positive rule or inviolable usage in such cases, willing that their manner and form should be altered according to the circumstances of time and determinations of men of sound judgment. Every end and object of law and enactment it was his design to educate should effect. One, then, of the retras was, that their law should not be written. Another is particularly levelled against luxury and expensiveness, for by it was ordained that the ceilings of their houses should only be wrought by the axe, and their gates and doors smoothed only by the saw. Epaminondas's famous dictum about his own table, that treason and a dinner like this do not keep company together, may be said to have been anticipated by Lycurgus. Luxury and a house of this kind could not well be companions, for a man might have a less than ordinary share of sense that would furnish such plain and common rooms with silver-footed couches and purple coverlets and gold and silver plate. Doubtless he had good reason to think that they would proportion their beds to their homes, and their coverlets to their beds, and the rest of their goods and furniture to these. It is reported that King Leotychides, the first of that name, was so little used to the sight of any other kind of work that, being entertained at Corinth in a stately room, he was much surprised to see the timber and ceiling so finely carved and panelled, and asked his host whether the trees grew so in his country. A third ordinance of Retra was, that they should not make war often or long with the same enemy, lest that they should train and instruct them in war by habituating them to defend themselves, and this is what Agesilaus was much blamed for a long time after, it being thought that by his continual incursion into Boeotia he made the Thebans a match for the Lacedaemonians, and therefore Anticytus, seeing him wounded one day, said to him that he was very well paid for taking such pains to make the Thebans good soldiers, whether they would or no. These laws were called retras, to intimate that they were divine sanctions and revelations, in order to the good education of their youth, which as I said before, he thought the most important and noblest work of a lawgiver. He went so far back as to take into consideration their very conception and birth, by regulating their marriages, for Aristotle is wrong in saying that after he had tried always to reduce the women to more modesty and sobriety, he was at last forced to leave them as they were, because that in the absence of their husbands, who spent the best part of their lives in the wars, their wives, whom they were obliged to leave absolutely mistresses at the home, took great liberties and assumed the superiority, and were treated with overmuch respect and called by the title of lady or queen. The truth is, he took in their case also all the care that was possible. He ordered the maidens to exercise themselves with wrestling, running, throwing the quoit, and casting the dart, to the end that the fruit they conceived might, in strong and healthy bodies, take firmer root and find better growth, and withal that they with this great vigor might be the more able to undergo the pains of childbearing, and to the end he might take away their overgreat tenderness and fear of exposure to the air, and all acquired womanishness. He ordered that the young women should go naked in the processions, as well as the young men, and dance too, in that condition, at certain solemn feasts, singing certain songs, whilst the young men stood around, seeing and hearing them. On these occasions, they now and then made by jests of a fitting reflection upon those who had misbehaved themselves in the wars, and again sang encomiums upon those who had done any gallant action, and by these means inspired the younger sort with an emulation of their glory. Now, could this have been accomplished if they weren't naked? Those that were thus commended went away proud, elated, and gratified with their honor among the maidens, and those who were rallied were as sensibly touched with it as if they had been formerly reprimanded, and so much the more because the kings and the elders, as well as the rest of the city, saw and heard all that passed. Nor was there anything shameful in this nakedness of the young women. Modesty attended them, and all wantonness was excluded. It taught them simplicity and a care for good health, and gave them some taste of higher feelings, admitted as they thus were to the field of noble action and glory. Hence it was natural for them to think and speak as Gorgo, for example, the wife of Leonidas, is said to have done, when some foreign lady, as it would seem, told her that the women of Lacedaemon were the only women in the world who could rule men. With good reason, she said, for we are the only women who bring forth men. These public processions of the maidens, and their appearing naked in their exercises and dancings, were enticements to marriage, operating upon the young with the rigor and certainty, as Plato says, of love, if not of mathematics, but, well, nowadays we say chemistry, but yeah, but besides all this, to promote it yet more effectually, those who continued bachelors were in a degree disfranchised by law, for they were excluded from the sight of those public processions, in which the young men and maidens danced naked, and in winter time the officers compelled them to march naked themselves round the marketplace, singing as they went a certain song to their own disgrace, that they justly suffered this punishment for disobeying the laws. Moreover, they were denied that respect and observance which the younger men paid their elders, and no man, for example, found fault with what was said to Dryden, though so eminent a commander, upon whose approach one day a young man, instead of rising, retained his seat, remarking, "No child of yours will make room for me." In their marriages, the husband carried off his bride by a sort of force. Nor were their brides ever small and of tender years, but in their full bloom and ripeness. After this, she who superintended the wedding comes and clips the hair of the bride close round her head, dresses her up in a man's clothes, and leaves her upon a mattress in the dark. Afterwards comes the bridegroom, in his everyday clothes, sober and composed, as having supped at the common table, and entering privately into the room where the bride lies, unties her virgin zone, and takes her to himself. And after staying some time together, he returns composedly to his own apartment to sleep as usual with the other young men. Where's that book? Mind Styles, Lifestyles, something like that. It's around here somewhere. Or is it in a different room? Anyways, that's kind of sounds like what this one preacher said. This says the broad penny areas, as long as you stay outside of those. And they had this thing. Okay, well, unties. So poor women have to tie and untie themselves every time they go to the bathroom. And so he continues to do, spending his days, and indeed his nights, with them, visiting his bride in fear and shame, and with circumspection. And when he thought he should not be observed, she also, on her part, using her wit to help and find favorable opportunities for their meeting, when company was out of the way. In this manner they lived a long time, inasmuch as they sometimes had children by their wives before ever they saw their faces by daylight. Their interviews, being thus difficult and rare, served not only for continual exercise of their self-control, but brought them together with their bodies healthy and vigorous, and their affections fresh and lively, unsated and undulled by easy access and long continuance with each other, while their partings were always early enough to leave behind unextinguished in each of them some remaining fire of longing and mutual delight. Now, the nudity aforementioned, people, you can't sexualize it. Puberty sexualizes the body. Thank you very much. So people need to knock it off with that. But any level of what people would call immodesty kind of dulls the reaction when you get home, so that could be enhanced by, that. It's not that people are shutting that off, but readily being available for each other and all that, and finding comfort outside of that, what's the issue there? Perhaps there could be a greater rate of childbirth if it was, but maybe not, because then they don't have that level of comfort with each other per se, in a sustained way, so it may not take as many times to get pregnant. Well, I mean, it's only the one time that it get, but you know what I mean. After guarding marriage with this modesty and reserve, he was equally careful to banish empty and womanish jealousy. For this object, excluding all licentious disorders, he made it, nevertheless, honorable for men to give the use of their wives to those whom they should think fit, that so they might have children by them. Okay, ridiculing those in whose opinion such favors are so unfit for participation as to fight and shed blood and go to war about it. Lycurgus allowed a man who was advanced in years and had a younger wife to recommend some virtuous and approved young man, that she might have a child by him, who might inherit the good qualities of the father and be a son to himself. On the other side, an honest man who had love for a married woman upon account of her modesty and the well-favoredness of her children, might, without formality, beg her company of her husband, that he might raise, as it were, from this plot of good ground, worthy and well-allied children for himself. And indeed Lycurgus was of persuasion that children were not so much the property of their parents as of the whole commonwealth, and therefore would not have his citizens begot by the first comers, but by the best men that could be found. The laws of other nations seemed to him very absurd and inconsistent, where the people would be solicitous for their dogs and horses as to exert interest and to pay money to procure fine breeding, and yet keep their wives shut up to be made mothers only by themselves, who might be foolish, infirm, or diseased, as if it were not apparent that children of a bad breed would prove their bad qualities first upon those who kept and were rearing them, and well-born children in like manner their good qualities. And we find that this sort of behavior in a different way, you can't completely shut this stuff off. And as much as people say enlightened and all that other stuff, it increases both domestic violence and other violence the more this stuff happens in society, no matter what the stuff that. But that's the point. They want a heartless warrior that either separates himself from that level of attachment to family, or they want him to channel that going elsewhere. Now, we don't always have that. And in military men, adultery from their wives, whether they've sanctioned it or not, doesn't seem to play off too well, too. But, people have their ideals. These regulations found on natural and social grounds were certainly so far from that scandalous liberty which was afterwards charged upon their women, that they knew not what adultery meant. It is told, for instance, that of Garadas, a very ancient Spartan, that being asked by a stranger what punishment their law had appointed for adulterers, he answered, "There are no adulterers in our country." "But," replied the stranger, "suppose there were." "Then," answered he, "the offender would have to give the plaintiff a bull with a neck so long as that he might drink from the top of the Taugetus of the Eurotas river below it." The man, surprised at this, said, "Why, 'tis impossible to find such a bull." Garadas smilingly replied, "'Tis as possible to find an adulterer in Sparta. So much I had to say of their marriages." And well, it's approved adultery is still adultery, but yeah. Nor was it in the power of the father to dispose of the child as he thought fit. He was obliged to carry it before certain triers at a place called Lesch. These were some of the elders of the tribe to which the child belonged. Their business it was carefully to view the infant, and if they found it stout and well made, they gave order for its rearing, and allotted to it one of the 9,000 shares of land above mentioned for its maintenance. But if they found it puny and ill-shaped, ordered it to be taken to what was called the apotheta, a sort of chasm under Taugetus, as thinking it neither for the good of the child itself nor for the public interest that it should be brought up, if it did not from the very outset appear made to be healthy and vigorous. Upon the same account the women did not bathe the newborn children with water, as is the custom in all other countries, but with wine, to prove the temper and complexion of their bodies, from a notion they had that epileptic and weak children faint and waste away upon their being thus bathed, while, on the contrary, those of a strong and vigorous habit acquire firmness and get a temper by it, like steel. There was much care and art, too, used by the nurses. They had no swaddling bands. The children grew up free and unconstrained in limb and form, and not dainty and fanciful about their food, not afraid in the dark, or of being left alone, and without peevishness, or ill humor, or crying. Upon this account, Spartan nurses were often brought up, or hired by people of other countries, and it is recorded that she who suckled Alcibiades was a Spartan, who, however, if fortunate in his nurse, was not so in his preceptor, his guardian. Pericles, as Plato tells us, chose a servant for that office called Sapyrus, no better than any common slave. Lycurgus was of another mind. He would not have masters bought out of the market for his young Spartans, nor such as should sell their pains. Nor was it lawful, indeed, for the father himself to breed up the children after his own fancy. But as soon as they were 7 years old, they were to be enrolled in certain companies and classes, where they all lived under the same order and discipline, doing their exercises and taking their play together. Of these, he who showed the most conduct and courage was made captain. They had their eyes always upon him, obeyed his orders, and underwent patiently whatsoever punishment he inflicted, so that the whole course of their education was one continued existence of a ready and perfect obedience. The old men, too, were spectators of their performances, and often raised quarrels and disputes among them to have a good opportunity of finding out their different characters, and of seeing which would be valiant, which a coward, when they should come to a more dangerous encounters. Reading and writing they gave him just enough to serve their turn. Their chief care was to make them good subjects, and to teach them to endure pain and conquer in battle. To this end, as they grew in years, their discipline was proportionately increased, and their heads were close clipped. They were accustomed to go barefoot, and for the most part to play naked. Now, going back here, I would say that if you neglect your children to the point where they die, you've murdered your children. And by children, of course, I mean pre-adolescents. And per se, if one has mentally challenged adult children, then that's a different thing too. But they are right in the respect about, I would totally agree in the respect that people should be mentally and physically trained. Not per se the point of such strict fascism that parents don't have control over that. You know, it's this left-wing sort of thing, but definitely to better their performance. After they were 12 years old, they were no longer allowed to wear any undergarments. They had one coat to serve them a year. Their bodies were hard and dry, but with but little acquaintance of baths and unguents. These human indulgences they were allowed only on some few particular days in the year. They lodged together in little bands upon beds made of the rushes which grew by the banks of the river Eurotas, which they were to break off with their hands without a knife. As if it were winter, they mingled some thistle down with the rushes, which it was thought had the property of giving warmth. By the time they were come to this age, there was not any of the more hopeful boys who had not a lover to bear him company. The old men, too, had an eye upon them, coming often to the grounds to hear and see them contend either in wit or strength with one another, and this as seriously and with as much concern as if they were their fathers, their tutors, or their magistrates, so that there scarcely was any time or place without some one present to put them in mind of their duty, and punish them if they had neglected it. Besides all this, there was always one of the best and honestest men in the city appointed to undertake the change and governance of them. He again arranged them into their several bands, and set over each of them for their captain the most temperate and boldest of those they called Irons, who were usually 20 years old, 2 years out of the boys, and the oldest of the boys again were Irons, as much as to say who would shortly be men. These young men, therefore, was their captain when they fought, and their master at home, using them for the offices of his house, sending the eldest of them to fetch wood, and the weaker and less able to gather salads and herbs, and these they must either go without or steal, which they did by creeping into the gardens or conveying themselves cunningly and closely into the eating houses. If they were taken in the fact, they were whipped without mercy, for thieving so ill and awkwardly. They stole, too, all other meats they could lay their hands on, looking out and watching all opportunities when people were asleep or more careless than usual. If they were caught, they were not only punished with whipping, but hunger too, being reduced to their ordinary allowance, which was but very slender, and so contrived on purpose that they might set about to help themselves, be forced to exercise their energy and address. This was the principal design of their hard fare. There was another, not inconsiderable, that they might grow taller, for the vital spirits not being overburdened and oppressed by too great a quantity of nourishment, which necessarily discharges itself into thickness and breadth, do by their natural lightness rise, and the body giving as yielding because it is pliant, grows in height. The same thing also, to conduce to beauty of shape, a dry and lean habit is a better subject for nature's configuration, which the gross and overfed are too heavy to submit to properly, just as we find that women who take physic whilst they are with child bear leaner and smaller, but better shaped and prettier children. The material they come of having been more pliable and easily molded. The reason, however, I leave others to determine. Now, I would strongly urge against the idea of putting people in a position that it's going to seem like they need to steal to survive. But I understand they were trying to turn them into predators, you could say. So, as good army men. To return from whence we have digressed, so seriously did the Lacedaemonian children go about their stealing, that a youth, having stolen a young fox and hid it under his coat, suffered it to tear out his very bowels with its teeth and claws, and died upon the place, rather than let it be seen. What is practiced at this very day in Lacedaemon is enough to gain credit to this story, for I myself have seen several of the youths endure whipping to death at the foot of the altar of Diana, surnamed Orthia. The Iran, our undermaster, used to stay a little with them after supper, and one of them he bade to sing a song, Another he put a question which required an advised and deliberate answer. For example, who was the best man of the city? What he thought of such an action of such a man? They used them thus early to pass a right judgment upon persons and things, and to inform themselves of the abilities or defects of their countrymen. If they had not an answer ready to the question, who was a good or who an ill reputed citizen, they were looked upon as of a dull and careless disposition, and to have little or no sense of virtue and honor. Besides this, they were to give a good reason for what they said, and in as few words as comprehensive as might be. He that failed of this, or answered not to the purpose, had his thumb bit by the master. Sometimes the Urin did this in the presence of the old men and magistrates, that they might see whether he punished them justly and in due measure or not. And when he did amiss, they would not reprove him before the boys, but when they were gone, he was called to an account and underwent correction if he had run far into either of the extremes of indulgence or severity. Their lovers and favorers, too, had a share in the young boy's honor or disgrace. And there goes a story that one of them was fined by the magistrate because the lad whom he loved cried out effeminately as he was fighting. And though this sort of love was so approved among them that the most virtuous matrons would make professions of it to young girls, yet rivalry did not exist, and if several men's fancies met in one person, it was rather the beginning of an intimate friendship, whilst they all jointly conspired to render the object of their affection as accomplished as possible. They taught them also to speak with a natural and graceful raillery, and to comprehend much matter of thought in few words. For Lycurgus, who ordered, as we saw, that a great piece of money should be but of inconsiderable value, on the contrary, would allow no discourse to be current which did not contain in few words a great deal of useful and curious sense. Children in Sparta, by habit of long silence, came to give just and sententious answers, for indeed as loose and incontinent livers are seldom fathers of many children, so loose and incontinent talkers seldom originate many sensible words. King Agis, when some Athenian laughed at their short swords, and said to the jugglers on the stage, swallowed them with ease, answered him, "We find them long enough